Yo, what up? It's Chris. Ever get those games that you're like, well, maybe kinda, whoa, right? That's what we're talking about today. I've got two sitting in front of me. You can do the reads, but in case you're listening and not watching, we have Intent to Kill and DC deck building Justice League Dark. Right? Go into games sometimes and you just have this really low bar for, I'm kind of gonna like it, maybe sort of, and you play it and you go, it wasn't supposed to do that. It wasn't supposed to make me have the feels. It wasn't supposed to bring that type of joy to the tabletop. And both of these, in two completely different directions, have exceeded expectations in a mechanic that I know very well and enjoy wholeheartedly from a deck building side of things. Redemption-esque, if you will, or getting the chip off my shoulder for DC side of things. And then deduction. And if you've heard me speak on the channel, I am just not a big fan of these dry, purely deductive puzzle type games. And then I played it and I was like, let's go. So we're going to start out with Intent to Kill, and this is a very fascinating study of a game because it gives you the option of the entitled modes called Logic versus Intuition. And if you've watched my channel at all, you know I am completely illogical sometimes, so you know which mode I am going to prefer. So what you've got set up here in front of you on the board is sort of a mid-game setup for a game of an asymmetric cat versus mouse type scenario. Detective versus murderer. Murderer is going to be slowly, right? Murdering several civilians as you go along, one per round, and the detective is going to be using deduction and logic and the powers of good to, well, maybe figure out who they are, because their actions are limited, and the murderer kind of gets away with doing whatever they want, with some exceptions, which we'll talk about, and which the intuition mode just makes it even better, because with a lot of these one versus all games, or just even one versus one games, you definitely see with the experience learning curve, one side getting the advantage, and this game allows you to tailor it to your experience level. Now, whether that is both beginners, both experts, or something combination of both of them along the way. So our typical round in this game is very straightforward. It's very streamlined. And once you play this game once or twice, it's going to go very quickly. Even the first game was probably about 45 minutes for us. And you could easily have repeated plays at half an hour or less, but it is a little bit of potential snag in one main area as the main criticism and the main fault of this that you may have to be worried about, which gives the intuition mode the really stand on the shoulders of this is why you should play this mode above the other mode, in my humble opinion. But I'll get to that in a second. What you're doing essentially on a round-by-round basis is you can see I've got the murder tokens right here, these cards out that signify someone was murdered in that area. And so when that happens, the little wee detective goes to that area and you can gather clues, you can get evidence, you can find good stuff, and we'll talk about that in a second. That's more in the intuition mode. But then what the criteria for the murderer are actually set and predetermined based on a few random draws, because you're going to choose one of these character cards that's on the map prior to the beginning of the game, prior to them being set down as your murderer. You're going to write them down, and all of them have characteristics on them. Now, on this character card, for example, you can see the characteristics along the bottom. If I can get my hand and shadow out of the way, you have the age, you have the gender, you have the build size, and you have how tall they are. And so you've got 4 different criteria that you're going to be having to mix and match between all of these, as you can see here on all of these cards, because when you're the murderer, you're trying to figure out maybe not what's the most obvious. If there's only one 20-year-old in the deck that you're choosing from, that's probably not a good one to use if the next part of things and the detective is really smart or potentially really lucky, because you're going to have actually a deck that is never fully used, and so you're always going to have a plethora of options of these cards available to you, and you're going to be doing this over 5 rounds. You can see the 2 extra ones I have here for rounds 4 and 5. And a sample scenario round is that the murderer is set up at the beginning of the game with picking the murderer, like I mentioned, potentially have an accomplice, which is going to be someone else that can lie. And that becomes very important on the detective side of things. And then they're going to have one of the various factions that is their ally or sympathetic to their cause. And again, you don't use all of these at the beginning of the game. You basically choose one of 3 and then you set all 3 aside And then the rest of them are going to make up this deck, and you're going to need to draw these later at the end of every round so that you as the detective are going to be able to figure out which of these ones, for sure, when you pull them, you know that they're telling you the truth. But you don't know which ones are set aside, so you kind of, again, are having to deduce what may be left over in combination with the main portion of the detective phase, which we'll get to in just a second. Then the murderer is actually going to be constrained, like I mentioned, because they're going to have motive cards here. And these motive cards are basically going to dictate some of those characteristics that I mentioned of who they can kill, but also potentially the dynamic of where they're going to be killing. So for Cutthroat, you cannot murder in the 4 center blocks of the city, so I cannot murder in these 4. The Killer, you can only kill civilians that are alone in a block. The Terrorist, all victims have to be from different social groups. So all of these are going to give you a slight twist on them. And let me be clear, there are a lot of them. And the base game says, well, you all get a fair number of these set out in front of you because you're going to have the same set as the murderer, so you can see what they are visually in front of you, and so that the murderer remembers and doesn't make it too obvious which one they have. And so using those constraints, well, you can't kill yourself, you don't want to kill your accomplice, and, well, you're trying not to kill the ones that are going to lie for you in the first place. That's going to be how you're choosing in this grid-based system. And that is then emphasized on the detective's face because the detective moves to the latest murder scene. I just realized I put out the murder scenes of 1, 2, and 4. Ignore that completely if you're paying close attention. If you're not, well, that's fine too. But then what you're doing is you move to that murder scene, and then you get only a certain number of actions on your turn in order to figure out the clues that are going to allow you to do this. And, you get your handy dandy little paper card that you can fill out and start to mark and do all that fun stuff. Because the core premise of the detective's turn is to ask questions of the civilians that are remaining. And you have 11 potential questions based on those characteristics at the bottom of the cards that I showed you, right? Gender, there are 2 options there, male or female. And then you have 3 options for the age groups, 3 options for the size, and then 3 options for the build. And so those are going to be the 3. So 3 plus 3 plus 3 plus 2 is 11. Now, the best part about this is you go into a block and you can ask every civilian there a question. So you might be like, okay, well, I'm going to ask you this, and I'm going to ask you this. Oh, wait, though, they gave me conflicting answers. Oh, crap, I don't know which one is lying, because this is the key point of the game. If you are the murderer, if you are an accomplice, or if you are the faction that is loyal to them, sympathetic to them, then they can lie. They don't have to tell you the truth. But if they're not that, then the murderer has to tell you the truth. So how do you tell if these 2 people are in the same block and, well, one of them is lying and one of them isn't lying? Well, you ask them the same freaking question. But if you ask the same freaking question, then you might not have enough questions asked by the end of the 5th round. And again, that's with a slight caveat because the murderer can choose not to murder in one round, which will extend the game potentially if you so choose to do so. But that may also be a detriment because that sometimes happens when the conditions of murdering, the motifs that I just mentioned, are not able to be met, because if they're not able to murder in the outside and say there's no characters in some of the outside rings that are available, or I'm sitting in the one as the detective that is the only one with characters or civilians, well, again, you can't murder if the detective's there, and you can't kill yourself if you're the murderer, so you run into some constraints there. So again, the deduction portion of things is there from that aspect. The other portion are these little building standees that I tilted down on the table so you can see them easier from the overtop, because they're also going to all give you a little bit different actions that you can utilize. But the other thing that I didn't really point out yet that is important is actually part of the murderer's really other strength is you get to intimidate people, right? And so they actually just get to flip these little characters over, the civilians. And so now if they are on their gray side, as you can see here, right, they can't answer questions. So that's going to be the mitigation. Do you bluff, and do you make them think that these are the people that are going to be the ones that can answer the questions appropriately, or they're the ones that are sympathetic that are going to lie, or these are the ones that are going to tell you the truth? And you're trying to dynamically figure that out. But then it goes back to the actual actions that you're taking on a turn by turn as a detective, and these 4 different locations are going to be placed anywhere on the map. There's going to be 2 of them essentially on every single board setup that you're going to be dealing with, and as you're traversing, they allow you to interact with them in different ways and have different actions. The hospital, for example, allows you to comfort those intimidated people that I just talked about. And so you get to flip them back over to their colored side so you can then ask them the questions. And then you also have the fire station, which allows you to grab one of these other social groups that I mentioned that you get to draw from at the end of the round every time. And you get to look at this, and you not only then know what's in here, but you then get to move all of the people that are on that board of that faction to a different location, adjacent, if you will. And so that's going to be present. Then you also have the police station, which allows you to set out the surveillance token. The surveillance token means that you can get to ask somebody on a later turn or a later action, if you will, if they can be murdered. You get to ask the murderer if this person can be murdered. And so again, that's going to be helpful because, again, like I said, there are certain people that they cannot murder. And so that might be how you figure out if that one is the murderer without actually having to wait till the end of the game. This is going to give you another layer of deduction. And then you also have the diner, which is an extension of your basic action of asking a question in the first place. But not only can you then ask in the same block, you can ask in an adjacent block because otherwise you have to be located in the block to do it as well. And so maybe you're out of moves, or maybe you don't want to move because moving will then not allow you to ask it. So you can use that to manipulate the board in another way. After you've taken all your actions as the detective, though, then you go to the end of the round situation. And the end phase of things just, again, allows you to work with the public and hopefully civilians. So if you're in an area that has black and white characters, you get to comfort them and they become on their better side so they can answer questions. And then, again, as the second portion of things, each of you gets to move 2 characters and then draw one of these from the block. So you get to see, but the problem is you shuffle these up after every round. So you might draw the same one. So you're not going to know which of these 5 or so that are out there because you're always drawing the same 2. And that's not helping you deduce which of these are supporters and which one of them aren't so that you can figure out the line. But that comes in with the manipulation and the movement because then you can start pairing up colors to help you eliminate possibilities of the ones that you haven't drawn. Rinse and repeat over 5 rounds. And that is the basic deduction logic-based situation. However, you're going, Chris, you didn't talk about the intuition. Chris, why is the intuition better? And as you can imagine, the characteristics on these cards could be a little bit limiting in terms of choices and having enough variety there, especially constrained with the motive at the same time. So therein lies the Chris craziness, chaos that I love in the first place, right? The intuition, the guessing, the keeping you on your toes. And that comes in the form of additional murder cards and additional detective cards, essentially little power-ups that are going to keep you on your toes from being as purely deductive as this game can be in a nutshell on that aspect. Because as you can imagine, the murderer has the initial advantage, but once the detective starts rolling and knowing what to ask and how to manipulate a little bit further, the murderer actually ends up being on their toes and having a much harder role in terms of, well, prevention, because it's a little bit more bluffing, meta, I can't move as much as I'd like to, and a little bit more constrained. And so these cards spice things up because they not only change the murders, the motives, and the constraints in which they can kill, but they also offer some restrictions on the detective side of things, maybe not allowing to address or ask certain questions to certain civilians, or change the dynamics of how they're killing in the first place. And then lies the detective portion of things, because these cards, again, as I mentioned, is already being tilted in the detective's favor in the other mode, arguably. They are going to be much harder to get because these murderer cards are actually going to be 2 placed under every single murder victim. And so when the murder victim happens, they get to look at both of those and choose one to apply, and they can just play it at any time during their turn or when's applicable. The detective cards, on the other hand, are going to be a little bit harder to obtain. They're actually going to be utilized with the evidence in the evidence baggie anyway, but those are going to be acquired on a round by round basis. One potentially at the murder site that you'll get one, but then also potentially as a separate action if you choose to spend it to get another one. And they allow you to potentially get one of the 3 cards that's sitting face up that's going to help you when you are in a location of this matching the buildings that I mentioned earlier. So you're going to have to be in the right place, which makes them a lot harder. And you can only have one of them at a time. You can only save one of them. So you either use it right away or you keep it, but you can't get another one, even though you have another evidence token, until you use it. So it really is a use it or lose it potential scenario. And that makes the game just spiced up so much more. And I went into this going, oh, this is going to be, yeah, right. And that's what you want out of a game. I like the unpredictability. I like the learning curve. I like the time frame in which it is accomplished. This is not a game that overly stays its welcome, unduly. It is the exact right length for a game of this nature. The head-to-head dueling nature is just fantastic of the yin and the yang. And the experience, well, it can matter and it can also not matter because you can take it as seriously or not seriously as you like. This isn't just a dry, I'm a smarter optimizer than you. There can be some manipulation, there can be some bluffing, and the intuition mode just exemplifies that rather than, throws all the strategy out the window. It makes you be smarter about some of the intuition, but it doesn't remove you being a master logician at the same time. It just enhances it in all the right ways. And so, frankly speaking, I like the regular mode, but I'm in love with the intuition mode because it just speaks to me as a gamer of saying, you know what? I'm going to reward you for being smart, but I'm going to reward you even more for being clever. And I love being clever. Doctor Who insert quote here. Now I mentioned, right, the downside of this is a whole, right, is that these cards only have so many icons or things at the bottom. And so if you just happen to like Scooby-Doo guess the right things and get a really good luck situation of the social groups pulled at the beginning, yeah, you can definitely have things skewed in your favor. And that's where the detective is a lot stronger, especially at the beginning. And the murderer, if you're not using the intuition mode, doesn't have as much catch up or balancing if the luck is really rolled that way. And so, as weird as it sounds, if you don't like the luck of that, you're going to want the luck of the other, even if you're not a luck person. I don't know why I'm doing this motion, but it's fun to do. And that's the biggest downside as a whole. Apart from that, there's not the analysis paralysis, there's not the confusion, there's a very limited action. So if you're looking more from a Euro pure side of things, the action selection is tight. As much as I hate saying that, it makes you really have to choose. And the other thing you have to be very careful about when you're filling this out is that it's easy to overestimate what you've actually decided. Because at the beginning of the game, if you think they're telling the truth and you're not paying attention, they could be lying. You don't really know. And sometimes you get lucky because you think that they were telling the truth and they were, but it wasn't because you were smart. It was because you just didn't realize that one of them could have been lying to you right away. And yeah, well, that happens too. Not saying that's happened to me or anything. So that is Intent to Kill. That is why it is intently awesome as well. So if you're interested in this, I mean, you should give 20th Century Games a look-see because they're importing it over at the time of me filming this. Now, DC deck building, Justice League Dark. Another surprise in a good way. So now we're talking about DC deck building, right? And truth be told, right? Like transparency. In my head, ever since I got into the hobby, DC deck building compared to Marvel Legendary has always been the little stepbrother. It's always been the lesser of two in my minds. And, you know, in the recent years, we've seen from Cryptozoic a sort of reimagining, a reboot. Not that DC has done that at all on the comic book side of things or the movies, or could use it again. And it's not like we're seeing the, I don't know, 5th Superman movie since I've been an adult rebooted again, right? Because if we don't need more origin stories of Superman and Spider-Man, what do we need in the first place, right? But side tangent aside, well, what we're really talking about here is why this is now better. Feels like to me because they've taken a look deep down and said, okay, some of the issues, especially the often aligned or just overarchingly main criticism of the original of being sort of a runaway leader problem, a strong getting stronger, and, you know, refine some of the mechanics in a different way to give some more balance or just uniqueness to this. And so again, I went into this saying, you know, I like the idea of DC. I like the idea of Dark because it's not your just traditional sunshiny regular folks. You know, who doesn't love a little John Constantine in their life? And RIP show. But that is what we're going on here. And I said, okay, going into this, you know, again, low expectations. You know, you've got your generic starters that you build your deck out of that give you, you know, your power, which is just your buy-in stuff. And, you know, you've got your clog up worth nothing sort of cards as well. And then you've got these defense cards that you can transform and transform. Okay. And then what am I sealing? Defending? Putting stuff back in my hand? Incantation? Transforming? There? Defend? What? Why do I? What? Oh, good gracious. Keyword central. And that's the other side of Marvel Legendary, which has, I don't want to say jump the shark in terms of the amount of keywords, but 40 plus expansions later, we're talking about a ton of stuff to try and remember anytime you take out or mismatch or match the content that you want to play with on a game by game basis, as someone who owns probably about half a dozen for Marvel, you know, Legendary in the first place. And so I said, okay, well, you know, truth be told, this box, I opened it up and I was like, oh, well, there's a whole lot of box. But this is not a whole lot of cards in front of me filling this box. This box is made for expansion content. That does not sit well with me when that's the first impression I have. However, this deck of cards here, although small appearing in the oversized box, and because that's really what it is, this box is probably just too big in the first place, because the amount of cards that's actually present here is fantastic in terms of not being totally, you know, like, okay, those are some duplicates from the other one, but not being totally asymmetric, but giving you just an absolute metric ton of some plethora in the actual stuff here. Your villains, your items, your abilities, your heroes. And the clever part of this game isn't just the mechanics that you're familiar with, right? I mean, everyone's played deck building at this point if you're watching this. But those keywords that I mentioned there earlier, the sealed, allowing you to not only mitigate as well as wean your deck, which is the all-important, well-defined necessity in all of the deck building aficionados. I don't know, if you can't wean your deck, it's not any good. It's got you covered. The transforming also is clever because all of the heroes and villains have this unique requirement in your deck, in your discard, in your sealed, in whatever, to then replace their card with potentially one of these better versions of them in the first place. And the better versions are better sometimes, and sometimes, depending on the circumstances, you kind of want to revert because you can revert some of them. And it doesn't get away from the, mastermind situation if you're familiar with Marvel Legendary, where you've got all these bad guys and you beat them, you beat them, you beat them, you beat them. But again, it gives you a spice of life in terms of what's going on when you beat them to, well, just make your characters that much better. And if I actually get the location card out of the way there and just show you the villains, again, it's kind of cool because sometimes they'll attack you. Sometimes they'll do stuff when you beat them, but they're all worth victory points. And that's ultimately what this game comes down to, which can be, frankly speaking, a little anticlimactic when somebody beats the final villain and you're just scrolling through your deck. And that's probably the big criticism that I'd make is, sealing them, discarding them is useful for certain conditions, but it doesn't ultimately affect the end game state as much. And this is a game that I'd argue, I'm still not sure how I feel about the end game and the end game scoring, just like with Marvel Legendary, where, I don't like playing that semi-co-op. That's a straight co-op for me. But the thing I did enjoy is the mechanistic approach. The journey to the end was actually incredibly more meaningful and enjoyable than I was expecting, right? Because the other criticism of a lot of these deck building games is when you're just laying your cards down, playing your whole hand, rinsing, repeating, it gets a little grindy, it gets a little old, it gets a little predictable. And the spice that's in here in terms of the combos that you're making, right? After you have the option of destroying, discarding, or sealing this card from any zone, draw a card, or you can use it for the +2 power. And so when you choose to do these additional effects as you're going along, or when you choose to activate these powers as the heroes, they really seem to make more of a difference than I was expecting. And that in and of itself, as you're going through here with the villains to transform here as well, sealing a location you control, but if you do, seal this card and gain the upgrade, otherwise get +3 power. Again, the dynamics of all of these and how they're interacting with the other things like the equipment. You may destroy the card in the market. If you destroyed a card with 5 cost or greater, draw a card. All of these things, they seemed relevant. They seemed complementary. It didn't seem like there were a lot of cards that were just like, why is this card even in the deck? No one's going to buy this from the marketplace. Because if there was one that came up there that wasn't with your strategy, you can have a lot of cards like the one I just read that just allow you to trash and get rid of it and replenish along those ways. A lot of things that are allowing you to manipulate the discard pile. A lot of things that are allowing you to manipulate the sealed pile. And it gives you those areas that it spices it up, even though the core loop of play on my cards and rinse and repeat and go is still the same. I guess what I'm saying is the sum of the individual parts was much more than the individual parts themselves, even though I still feel like the journey is there and I still feel mixed about the end game scoring. And again, I wasn't expecting to say that with this. And it makes me want to actually get a couple more expansions now, including the most upcoming released one, because I'm a big, like Batman Arkham, Asylum situation. I've got my DC United coming. And so their upcoming Arkham Asylum expansion incorporated with this to just make that deck a little bit larger, to incorporate a few other keywords to give some more dynamic. It feels like it would make it more in a great way rather than more for the sake of more or more for the complexity of the random keywords that you're having to smash together. And I know that from the forums and from reading about this prior to, getting this in the first place, there is some issue with that. But the overarching compatibility is play what you want and have fun with it because the characters are dynamic, they're thematically incorporated, and especially with these new mechanics, even though this game, I don't know, is what, like 2022-ish, it works. And so I'm really interested in getting more. And I wasn't expecting that. And so that's the sign of a game for me that is good. I want to play it more and I want to get more of it because I know I can get it played. Is it more complex than some of the Marvel Legendary stuff I have that I play with the kids? Yeah, it is. But I don't have some of the latest stuff from Marvel Legendary. But so it would be a step up. But it's an opportunity, just like with Intent to Kill, it allows you to be clever with some of these combos that you're making, even though you're just laying your hand down and sort of doing the poker, here's what I got, boys. Because, again, it just does a little bit more in those ways than just your average. So I think this is an absolutely smashing thing if you're looking to get into it or getting into it and having a little bit extra. Again, I wouldn't mind a few more villains to mix those up additionally. It can overstay its welcome. And so I'd probably, especially with the kids, customize it down and maybe not use all of the villains they recommend. And they even say you can use one more to make the game length longer, but easily customizable from that aspect. I just wouldn't mind a couple extras. So pick up a small expansion pack, throw, a few in here for some variability. So there's unpredictability. Have just a slightly larger deck over here. I mean, the asymmetric character powers here are nice. They're not anything to write home about. And you really don't have a clue the first time or two you're playing this, which one of these are going to be helpful and how it's going to affect your play style as a whole. So, I mean, that's fine. Do they need to be oversized? Not at all. But, I mean, those things are nice. The heroes and the villains and the transform and the seal keywords, though, are outstanding. And they are the standout of this. And I love seeing it. So, yeah, if you're a DC fan, it's a good time to be that, because I think these card games are giving some more life into it. And I'm glad to see Cryptozoic has done well with this one. So, there you go. That's all I got. Stay classy. Thanks for watching. Peace out.